The hollow record on the bridge showed a grainy image of Commander Chandler, eyes bloodshot and voice raw. "This is a final transmission from the colony ship Procyon. Our engines are failing. We're adrift in an uncharted system. If anyone receives this, for God's sake, don't come looking." A chill ran down my spine, though the bridge of the salvage one was sweltering. Our life support was always on the fritz, and the air reeked of sweat and engine grease. I glanced at the rest of the crew, their faces grim. 20 years, muttered Chief Engineer Wu, his fingers dancing across the console. That message is 20 years old. "And we're still hauling ass towards that godforsaken system," I said, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow. I was the ship's medic, but my skills were rarely needed. Our biggest threat wasn't injury or disease, but the slow creep of despair that came with our line of work. We were scavengers, picking through the bones of failed colonies, abandoned research stations, and crashed ships. It was a dirty job, but someone had to do it. Resources were scarce, and the megacorporations that ran the galaxy weren't about to waste money on lost causes. "We have a contract," Captain Parker said, his voice flat. "The Procyon carried valuable cargo. We retrieve it, we get paid." "And if we find survivors?" Wu asked. Parker shrugged. "We follow protocol. Assess, stabilize, and transport to the nearest relay station. If there are no survivors..." He trailed off. No survivors meant a bigger payout for us. Salvage rights, corporate bonuses, the whole shebang. But a part of me, the part that still clung to the tattered remnants of my medical oath, hoped we'd find someone alive. The salvage one lurched as it dropped out of hyperspace, the colony planet looming large on the bridge's main screen. It was a green orb, shrouded in dense clouds and ringed by a field of shattered satellites and spent boosters. "Looks inviting," Wu said, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Let's get this over with," Parker said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Prep the landing gear and launch the probe." As the probe descended, its sensors relayed data to our screens. Atmospheric readings, radiation levels, temperature, and something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "What the hell is that?" Wu asked, pointing to a series of irregular blips on the scanner. "Unknown," Parker said, his voice tight. "But it's organic, and it's everywhere." I swallowed, a cold knot forming in my stomach. We had a contract, sure. But contracts could be broken, and some things were better left undisturbed. Parker exhaled slowly, the sound harsh in the tense silence of the bridge. "We're going in." His words fell like a sentence. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Were we stepping into a death trap, a quarantine zone, or something far worse? As we descended, the world outside became an indistinct mass of green and brown. The probe's transmission painted a disturbing picture. Dense vegetation, mutated flora, and those anomalies. The organic readings were spiking with a life that seemed both alien and uncannily familiar. The landing was rough, the salvage one shuddering as its landing gear met the overgrown soil. I braced myself against the medbay counter, the metallic tang of fear rising in my throat. "Stay sharp!" Parker's voice crackled over the intercom. "We move out in 5. We emerged from the salvage one into a humid world. The air was filled with the smell of decay and something sweeter, a cloying, almost floral scent that tickled the back of my nose. "Motion trackers on," Parker ordered. "Keep your eyes peeled and your weapons ready." The colony ruins lay ahead, a sprawling complex of rusted metal and overgrown vegetation. The structures were twisted and warped, as if the ground beneath them had buckled and heaved. As we moved deeper into the ruins, the organic readings on our scanners went haywire. We rounded a corner and stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree. Its trunk gnarled and twisted into a human form. Its branches reached out like arms, ending in clusters of pods. "What in God's name?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. The pods burst open, spewing a cloud of spores into the air. I coughed, gagging on the sweet, sickly taste. The spores settled on us, wriggling and squirming like insects. I brushed them off frantically, but they clung tenaciously to the fabric. "Get them off!" Wu's voice crackled over the comms, a hint of panic in his tone. "They're getting inside me!" I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if 1,000 tiny needles were piercing my flesh. I stumbled, catching myself on a nearby wall. The pods and the monstrous tree blurred into a nightmarish kaleidoscope. I heard Parker shouting, his voice distant and distorted. "Medic! We need the medic!" I tried to respond, but my words were garbled, lost in the rising tide of sickness. I collapsed to my knees, the world fading to black. When I awoke, it was to the acrid stench of disinfectant and the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. I was back on the Salvage 1, strapped to a cot in the cramped medbay. Parker stood over me, his face lined with worry. "You gave us quite a scare, Doc," he said, his voice gruff. "Wu managed to get you back inside before it was too late." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and scratchy. Parker handed me a cup of water, and I sipped it gratefully. "What happened?" I croaked. "The spores." "Nasty stuff," Parker said, shaking his head. "Wu is analyzing them now. Seems they're some kind of parasitic fungus. They attach themselves to a host and, well, let's just say they're not friendly." "But I'm okay?" I asked. Parker hesitated. "For now. We're keeping you isolated just in case." The thought of those alien spores burrowing into my flesh, taking root, was enough to make my stomach churn. "What about the others?" I asked. "They're fine," Parker said. "A few minor infections, but nothing serious. We're lucky Wu is a whiz with biochem." I nodded, relieved, but the relief was short-lived. "We found something," Parker continued, his voice low. "Something that explains what happened to the Procyon colonists." He handed me a datapad, its screen filled with images captured by the probe. The pictures showed the colonists, or what was left of them. They were fused with the plant life, their bodies twisted and deformed, their faces barely recognizable. Some had sprouted leaves and vines, others bore strange fruits. "They're alive," Parker said, "but they're not human anymore." I stared at the images, my mind reeling. The colonists had become part of the ecosystem, consumed by the parasitic spores and transformed into something alien. The thought of it was both fascinating and horrifying. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "This place is... it's not right." Parker nodded grimly. "I agree. We'll collect what we can and get out of here. But first, we need to make sure those spores don't spread. We can't risk bringing them back to the rest of the galaxy. We were scavengers, not saviors. Our job was to survive, to extract what we could from the ruins of others' failures. But this time we had a responsibility to contain the horror we had unleashed." As I lay back on the cot, the beeping of the medical equipment a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent medbay, I couldn't deny the gut feeling that we had only scratched the surface of the nightmare that awaited us on this forsaken planet. The medbay's door hissed open, revealing Wu, his face pale and drawn. He held a datapad, his eyes fixed on its glowing screen. "I've finished the analysis," he said, his voice strained. "The spores, they're not just parasitic. They're..." He paused, searching for the right word. "Symbiotic. You mean they form a beneficial relationship with their host?" Wu shook his head. "Not in the way you're thinking. These spores don't just coexist with their host, they merge with them. They rewrite the host's DNA, altering their physiology, their very being." "Like the colonists," I said, the images from the probe flashing through my mind. "Exactly," Wu confirmed. "The spores integrate themselves into the host's nervous system, creating a neural network that links them to the other infected organisms. They become part of a larger collective consciousness." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. "A hive mind," I murmured. Wu nodded. "Of sorts. But it's more complex than that. The spores seem to be drawn to a central intelligence, a kind of controller." "The tree," Parker said, his eyes widening. "Precisely," Wu affirmed. That monstrous tree is the heart of this network, the entity that guides and directs the infected. I struggled to sit up, my body protesting. So what does this mean for me, for the rest of us? Wu hesitated. It's hard to say. The spores in your system are dormant for now, but they could activate at any time. If they do, you'll become part of the network, your mind and body subsumed by the collective. Was I already infected? Was my mind slowly being overtaken by the alien spores? Parker's gaze hardened with resolve. We need more information. If these spores are the key to what happened to the colonists, then understanding them could be our only way out of this mess. Wu nodded in agreement. We need to find a way to communicate with the infected, learn how the spores work, and maybe even find a way to reverse their effects. I looked at them both, hope replacing the dread in my gut. Perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps there was a chance to fight back, to save ourselves and maybe even the colonists from this horrifying fate. Then let's get to it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We're scavengers, not quitters. We'll figure this out. Parker, Wu, and I ventured back into the heart of the colony, this time armed with more than just our standard-issue blasters. Wu had rigged up a scanner, a jury-rigged contraption of wires and salvage tech, designed to detect the fungal spores and map the extent of the infection. We moved cautiously, our eyes darting from shadow to shadow, weapons at the ready. The deeper we went, the more apparent the transformation of the colony became. Buildings were enveloped in vines, their once sleek surfaces now covered in a carpet of moss and fungi. Strange fruits hung from twisted branches, their skins glistening with an oily sheen. We came across the remains of a colonist, their body half submerged in a pool of viscous ooze. The sight was both horrifying and fascinating. Vines snaked through their flesh, their limbs deformed. Yet their chest still rose and fell with a slow, rhythmic breath. They're not dead, I whispered. There's something else. Wu knelt beside the colonist, his gloved hands carefully examining the fungal growths. The spores have completely integrated with their body, he muttered. They're part of the network now. Can we communicate with them? Parker asked, his voice tense. Wu shook his head. I doubt it. Their minds are no longer their own. They're just extensions of the central intelligence. The tree. We continued our exploration, the scanner's readings guiding us towards areas of high fungal activity. We found the colony's central hub, a once bustling plaza now transformed into a macabre garden of flesh and foliage. In the center stood the tree, its immense trunk towering over us like a sinister monument to the colony's demise. Its branches glowed, the pods on their tips swelling and contracting with a disturbing rhythm. There, Wu said, pointing to a series of glowing nodules on the tree's trunk. Those are the communication nodes. If we can tap into them, we might be able to establish a link with the network. Parker nodded. Wu, see what you can do. Doc, keep an eye on the scanner. I'll provide cover. We took up positions, our weapons trained on the surrounding foliage. Wu set to work, his fingers deftly manipulating the wires of his device. I watched the scanner's readings, my heart pounding in my chest as the needle crept towards the red zone. Suddenly, the scanner shrieked, its alarm blaring through the clearing. The ground beneath us trembled, and the tree's branches thrashed wildly. What's happening? Parker asked. Wu's eyes were wide with alarm. I don't know. The network. It's reacting to our presence. I saw figures emerging from the surrounding foliage. They were the colonists, their bodies contorted and overgrown. They advanced on us, their movements slow, like puppets on a string. I fired a shot, but it went wide, hitting a nearby tree trunk. The colonists closed in, their faces a mask of twisted flesh and fungal growths. They reached out to me, their gnarled hands grasping at me. I lashed out, my fist connecting with a leathery cheek, the sound of the satisfying crunch filling the clearing. The colonist recoiled, momentarily stunned. Parker! I yelled, the word barely escaping my constricting throat. We need to move! Parker, his blaster spitting energy bolts, covered our retreat. Wu, clutching his precious scanner, stumbled alongside me, his breath coming in gasps. We ran, the dense foliage whipping at our faces, the ground uneven beneath our feet. The colonists pursued, their unearthly howls a chorus of hunger and rage. "This way!" Parker shouted, diving into a narrow opening concealed by a curtain of vines. We followed, the path twisting and turning. We emerged into a cavern, its walls covered with glowing moss. "We can't stay here!" Wu wheezed, his chest heaving. "They'll find us!" "We need a plan," Parker said, his eyes scanning the cavern. "Something to give us an edge." I slumped against a moss-covered boulder, my head throbbing. The spores were wreaking havoc on my system, clouding my thoughts, twisting my perceptions. But through the haze, I noticed something. "The network," I gasped. "It's everywhere." Wu's eyes widened with understanding. "Of course! The spores are the conduits connecting every living thing to the central intelligence. This entire cave is part of the network." "So we're surrounded," Parker said grimly. "Not necessarily," I countered. "If this cave is part of the network, then we're part of it too. We just need to learn how to use it." I reached out, my hand brushing against the moss. A jolt of energy surged through my body, a kaleidoscope of images and sensations flooding my mind. I saw the network, a vast web of interconnected minds. I felt the hunger of the colonists, their desire to consume and assimilate. And then I saw a weakness, a vulnerability in the network's defenses, a way to turn the tables on our pursuers. "I have an idea," I said. Parker and Wu looked at me, their eyes filled with hope. "Let's hear it," Parker said, his voice steady. I closed my eyes, focusing on the network's rhythm. The spores within me hummed in response, a low, steady thrumming that resonated with the cavern's own energy. "The colonists," I said. "They're connected. They share a consciousness." Parker's eyes narrowed. So, I continued, struggling to maintain focus as the spores coursed through my veins. "If we can disrupt the network, we can disrupt them." Wu's eyes lit up. "A feedback loop," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "If we overload the network with conflicting signals, it could cause a system-wide shutdown." "But how?" Parker asked, his skepticism evident. "The scanner," I said, my voice growing stronger. "It can detect the fungal energy. If we amplify the signal, broadcast it back into the network, we might be able to scramble their senses." Wu finished my thought. "Disorient them, confuse them, give us a chance to escape." Parker hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Wu, get to work on the scanner. Doc, keep yourself together. We're going to need you." Wu immediately started tinkering with his device, the wires sparking and sizzling as he adjusted the settings. Parker took up a defensive position, his blaster aimed at the cavern entrance. I closed my eyes again, focusing on the network's rhythm. The spores within me seemed in unison, their energy flowing through my body, connecting me to the vast fungal consciousness. I reached out with my mind, probing the network's defenses. It was like swimming in a sea of glowing plankton, each spark a separate consciousness, all connected to a central source. I found the weakness, a nexus point where the individual consciousnesses converged. I pushed, sending a surge of energy into the network. The cave erupted in a racket of sounds. The colonists stumbled and faltered, their movements uncoordinated, their howls turning into confused grunts. Wu's scanner emitted a high-pitched whine as it amplified the feedback loop. I gritted my teeth, pushing harder, channeling the energy of the spores through my body. The world around me blurred, the sounds of the cavern fading into a dull roar. Then silence. The moss stopped glowing, the walls stilled. The colonists collapsed to the ground, their bodies convulsing before falling still. I opened my eyes, gasping for air. The spores within me were quiescent, their energy spent. "Did it work?" Parker asked. I looked around the cavern, at the inert bodies of the colonists, at the extinguished glow of the moss. "For now," I said, my voice hoarse. "But we need to get out of here, before the network reboots." We gathered our bearings and fled the cavern, the eerie silence amplifying our every footfall. We ran through the twisted forest, the mutated flora seeming to shrink back from us in fear. We reached the salvage one just as the first tendrils of light began to pierce the pre-dawn sky. We clambered aboard, sealing the hatch behind us. The liftoff was fast. We didn't waste a second getting out of there. Suddenly, the salvage one lurched violently, the ship groaning. Parker, strapped into the pilot's seat, wrestled with the controls. "What the hell's happening?" Wu shouted over the din, clinging to a railing for dear life. Before I could answer, a searing pain erupted in my skull, as if 1,000 needles were piercing my brain. I clutched my head, a scream tearing from my throat. The spores, I realized with horror. They were reacting to the network's distress, lashing out in an attempt to regain control. Images flooded my mind, a chaotic montage of twisted faces and writhing vines. The collective consciousness of the colony, enraged by our interference, was striking back. "It's the network!" I gasped, the words barely coherent through the pain. "It's attacking us!" Parker swore, his knuckles white as he fought to maintain control of the ship. The salvage one bucked and twisted, its hull groaning under the strain. "Hold on!" he yelled. "I'm trying to stabilize us, but the controls are barely responding." The pain in my head intensified. I felt my grip on reality slipping, the world around me dissolving into a swirling vortex of colors and sounds. Through the haze, I saw Wu collapse to the floor, his eyes vacant, his body twitching spasmodically. The spores had taken hold, turning him into a puppet of the network. "No!" I cried out, a sob escaping my throat. But my voice was drowned out by the sound of the engines as the salvage one plummeted towards the planet's surface. The impact was brutal, the ship slamming into the ground with bone-jarring force. I was thrown from my seat, my body slamming against the bulkhead. Pain flared through my limbs, but the agony in my head was even worse. I lay there, dazed and disoriented, the world a jumble of flashing lights and distorted shapes. I heard Parker groaning nearby, his voice weak. "We crashed," he mumbled. "We're down." I struggled to my feet, my legs wobbling beneath me. The ship's interior was a wreck, consoles shattered, wires sparking. Wu lay motionless on the floor, his body contorted into an unnatural pose. We had escaped the colony, only to be dragged back down by the network's insidious reach. We were trapped, injured and vulnerable. But then I remembered the spores within me, their energy still thrumming beneath the surface. If the network could use them to attack us, perhaps I could use them to fight back. I reached out with my mind, tapping into the fungal consciousness. The pain in my head subsided, replaced by a sense of clarity, of purpose. I felt the network's presence, its tendrils reaching out to consume us. But this time, I was ready. I channeled the spore's energy, focusing it into a single powerful blast. A wave of psychic force erupted from me, slamming into the network's tendrils, severing its connection to the ship. The salvage one shuddered, then went still. The lights steadied, the alarms fell silent. The psychic assault had ceased. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. The salvage one lay crippled, a broken insect amidst the sprawling jungle. Parker and I surveyed the damage, the reality sinking in. We were marooned. "Power's out," Parker reported, his voice raspy from the crash. "Life support's offline. We need to find shelter, and fast." My head still throbbed, a dull ache where the spores had waged war. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest for Wu. He was gone, consumed by the thing he sought to understand. We ventured out. The jungle was alive with sounds, the chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves, and a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Suddenly a figure emerged from the undergrowth, startling us both. It was a man, or what remained of one. His skin was mottled with fungal growths, his limbs gnarled and twisted, but his eyes, though clouded, held intelligence. He raised a hand not in aggression, but in a gesture that seemed almost welcoming. "Stay sharp," Parker whispered, his hand tightening around his blaster. But don't shoot unless I give the order. I stepped forward, my medical instincts overriding my fear. We're not here to harm you, I said. We were attacked. Our ship crashed. The man tilted his head as if considering my words, then he turned and beckoned us to follow. We exchanged a wary glance, but curiosity and the need for shelter won out. We trailed the man deeper into the jungle, the vegetation closing in around us like a living maze. He led us to a clearing, where a cluster of huts stood nestled amongst the trees. The structures were woven from vines and branches, their organic architecture blending seamlessly with the surrounding flora. Several figures emerged from the huts, their appearances as varied and disturbing as the first man's. Some were covered in moss, others sported bark-like skin. Yet they all shared the same intelligent gaze, the same air of cautious curiosity. A woman, her face adorned with delicate fungal tendrils, stepped forward. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "I am Anya. We are the remnants." "The remnants?" Parker asked, his suspicion evident. "Those of us who resisted the call of the hive," Anya explained. "We have learned to coexist with the spores, to use their power without succumbing to their control." "How?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Anya smiled, a gesture that was both beautiful and unsettling. "We have our ways. But first you must rest. You are injured." I looked down at my bruised and battered body, realizing how exhausted I was. Parker, too, seemed to sag with relief. We had found refuge, however temporary it might be. The remnants led us to one of the huts, a cozy dwelling filled with the scent of herbs and damp earth. They treated our wounds with poultices made from local plants, their touch surprisingly gentle, despite their altered forms. As I lay on a bed of woven vines, the events of the past few days replaying in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if the remnants were truly our allies, or if this was just another trap set by the hive. But as I drifted off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sounds of the jungle and the gentle touch of Anya's hand on my brow, I allowed myself a small bit of hope. Perhaps, in this twisted and corrupted paradise, we had found a trace of humanity, a chance to fight back against the encroaching darkness. I awoke to the smell of something earthy and pungent. It wasn't the disinfectant of the medbay, nor the stale metallic tang of the ship. Instead, it was a smell that spoke of life, decay, and something else, something alien. I opened my eyes, finding myself in a dark chamber. The walls were not metal, but a living network of interwoven vines and fungi. Parker was beside me, his face showing exhaustion and suspicion. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice rough. "Their sanctuary," a voice replied. Anya emerged from the shadows, her fungal tendrils swaying gently. "A place of healing and refuge." I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back down. "Healing? From what?" Anya's smile was a chilling mockery of comfort. "From yourselves," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "You are infected, Captain. Your friend as well. The spores have taken root." Panic surged through me, the familiar prickling sensation returning with renewed vigor. I could feel the spores writhing beneath my skin, their tendrils reaching deeper, invading my body, my mind. "We can help you," Anya continued, her voice a siren song. "We can teach you to embrace the change, to become one with the hive." Parker's hand tightened around his blaster. "Get away from him," he growled, his voice thick with venom. Anya's smile never wavered. "There is no escape, Captain," she said, her voice taking on a sinister edge. "The spores are in you. They are part of you. And soon, you will be part of us." The remnants closed in, their altered forms looming over us like statues. I tried to fight, to resist, but my body was betraying me. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish. Parker fired his blaster, the energy bolt scorching a hole in the living wall. But the remnants were unfazed. They moved with a speed and agility that belied their twisted forms, their fungal limbs snaking out to ensnare us. I was lifted off the ground, my body suspended in midair by a network of vines. Parker fought valiantly, but he was quickly overwhelmed, his blaster clattering to the floor as he was bound and gagged. We were carried deeper into the sanctuary, the air growing thicker, the fungal growths more abundant. The path led us to a massive chamber. In the center of it stood the tree, its immense trunk towering over us like a dark god. Its branches writhed like serpents, their tips dripping with a fluid that reeked of decay. The remnants placed us before the tree, their eyes gleaming with fanatical fervor. Anya stepped forward, her fungal tendrils reaching out to caress the bark. "Embrace the change," she whispered. "Become one with the hive." I felt the spores within me surge, their power overwhelming my resistance. The world around me lost focus, the faces of the remnants melting into a tableau of flesh and fungus. The last vestiges of my own will dissolved into the overwhelming tide of the collective consciousness. Parker's muffled cries faded into the background as I surrendered to the inevitable. We were the hives now, our bodies and minds twisted into new, horrifying shapes, forever bound to serve the will of the fungal overlord. Years later, I stood in the heart of the salvage one, its rusted hull now a part of the landscape, consumed by the verdant embrace of the fungal jungle. My skin bore the patterns of the symbiotic spores, mirroring the foliage that swayed around me. Parker stood beside me, his face showing the same acceptance that had replaced despair. We had become one with the hive, our individuality subsumed by the collective consciousness. Our minds, once sharp and independent, now buzzed with the ceaseless murmur of the network, a torrent of alien thoughts and sensations. The spores had rewritten our bodies too. My hands were gnarled, my skin toughened and mottled. Parker's form had grown hulking and moss-covered, his eyes glowing with a pale green light. We were no longer human, but something else entirely. We had become the guardians of the hive, its will our own. We patrolled the jungle, our senses attuned to the slightest disturbance in the network's delicate balance. We nurtured the fungal growths, guided the mutated colonists, and ensured the continued prosperity of our strange, twisted ecosystem. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I would catch a glimpse of my former self in the reflection of a dewdrop, a fleeting memory of the man I once was. A pang of loss would pierce my heart, a longing for the life I had left behind. But those moments were brief, fleeting. The spores had woven their tendrils deep into my soul, their whispers drowning out all memory of my past. I was the hive now, and the hive was me. One day as we surveyed the horizon, a speck appeared on the horizon. A ship, its engines a harsh intrusion in the symphony of the jungle. We watched as it descended, a sense of anticipation filling the network. New hosts, new minds to absorb, new bodies to assimilate. Parker and I exchanged a look, our fungal eyes gleaming. The hive was hungry, and it was time to feed.